Andrea Jenkins, and I work here at Ascent Funding, where I lead learning and education. My job and my team that I work with, we focus on financial and career education for our student borrowers. So I get to create content like this all the time to share with prospective borrowers, students, schools, and I'm usually not the one presenting. But I'm excited to be here with you all today and sharing a little bit more about this. Um, so today we're going to be talking about how to pay for graduate school. I know that graduate decisions can feel overwhelming, especially right now with so much changing in the graduate funding landscape. So today my goal is really to help eliminate a lot of the noise happening. We're going to cover kind of three core concepts. And my goal is to really that you walk away feeling more confident about what you're looking at. We're going to get really practical and, like I said, cover really three specific things: how cost actually works, what specifically is changing in graduate funding, and then what you can do next. So whether you are applying, deciding, already enrolled, hopefully today you walk away with a little bit more information that helps you to orient your plan. So let's dive in. If you're feeling uncertain right now, that is completely normal. So things have changed in the graduate funding space, and it's not always clear what applies to you. You also are kind of in a space where you might be headed to graduate school. You maybe know how undergraduate funding works, but asking, what's changing now that I'm kind of moving on to the next phase of my education. So today we're going to cover what's really different in grad school. And there are some things I do want you to walk away with. I want you to walk away with a clear understanding of what your program actually costs, or tools to evaluate what your program actually costs, what's changing with federal loans and what that does or maybe does not mean for you. And then I really want you to walk away with a simple way to calculate your own numbers after today, so that you can have accurate numbers as you're building your funding plan for the future. So again, the goal is to help you build a toolkit so you can get clear on your situation and understand what to do next. So let's get started with some of the questions we're actually hearing from students right now. So there are a lot of changes happening in the grad funding space, as I mentioned. There are a lot of common questions that we're hearing right now. These are coming directly from students we've been talking to over the last few months. I don't think you can see it because it's blurred around me, but I'm sitting in a hotel room at a conference meeting prospective MBA students, and I'm hearing these questions come up quite a bit. The biggest theme right now is uncertainty, especially with all the changes happening in grad funding as of July 1. So you might be wondering, can I still afford my program? What is actually changing with Grad PLUS? If you've already started a graduate program, you might be asking, how does this affect me? Or if federal loans don't cover everything, what do I do? If any of these questions feel familiar, you're in the right place. And I want to emphasize this: you don't need to solve for everything today. You just need to understand how to ask the right questions to get the information that you need to move forward. You also might be joining this thinking you're going to explore graduate funding and then finding yourself saying something's changing on July 1. I had no idea. If that's the case for you, I'm glad you're here. You're going to learn quite a bit today about what is changing. So let's jump in and really kind of first take a look at the structure of grad school cost itself. The cost itself doesn't really change much, and it's not really that dissimilar from what students experience in undergraduate programs. Cost of attendance still includes things like tuition, housing, living expenses, all of it. But what has changed is how that cost gets covered. So in graduate school, we typically see that there's less of the quote unquote free money on the table. That might mean that there are fewer grants and scholarships. There are no subsidized federal loans, which, if you're familiar with unsubsidized versus subsidized, no subsidized federal loans means that the loans you take federally, interest starts right away rather than waiting for program completion. And many students end up covering a lot more of the cost themselves. So even though the categories look familiar, the experience can feel really different. And what's really important to note is that those numbers look different for different students, and your particular situation is very unique to you. So one of the easiest mistakes to make in grad school planning is to look at the published cost. So people go to a website, they look at estimated cost, they look at things like cost of attendance, and they think that's their number. Um, and usually it's not. They publish a cost of attendance to give you a framework, and that framework matters, but it's your actual experience inside of that framework that can look very different depending on how you move through a program. So, as we talk through this slide and the various kind of factors that can impact your particular cost, I really want you to listen for not just what affects cost, but I want you to ask yourself, which of these variables am I actually controlling right now? So, for example, enrollment status, full-time, part-time, it's not just an academic choice, it's also a financial choice. Full-time may get you through the program faster, but it can also change your ability to work while enrolled. Part-time might feel more manageable month to month, but it could potentially stretch the timeline of how long you're in a program. It can affect how long you're carrying the cost. It can impact when you begin to repay. And another factor is program length. So program length matters for the same reason. Shorter programs are not automatically cheaper, and longer ones are not automatically bad. But the point is that time changes the math. Longer in school can mean longer living expenses, more time balancing work and school, and more time before you're done borrowing. Another factor that comes into play quite a bit is location. So students sometimes underestimate the difference. Two programs with really similar tuition can feel very different. If one requires relocation, maybe relocation to a place with higher rent or monthly parking if you have a car, or simple higher day-to-day cost of living. Location, I would also factor in thinking about an online versus on-campus program. Those costs can also feel really different. Um, and then there is funding. So the same program can look really different for two people. One student may get an assistantship, a fellowship, or they may have tuition reimbursement through their employer or some type of employer support, and others may not. So um, again, other students may have housing stability or family support. Others may be covering everything independently. Those are not small details. Those are things that impact, the way that you pay for your education. So the planning mindset that I really want to instill, and that I want you to take away is not just to ask what the program costs, but ask what does this program cost for someone enrolling the way I would enroll, living the way that I would live, and funding it the way that I plan to fund my education. Um, that question will get you a lot closer to the real cost of your education. And if you're trying to compare schools, it's also helpful in understanding those numbers so that you're not just comparing tuition alone, which can be misleading. A lower tuition program is not always a lower cost program once you factor in time, location, living expenses, and available funding. Um, and the big takeaway here is that your financial plan should be built around your actual setup, not just the number you see kind of on published on the website. Um, so once you get really grounded in your situation, it's then important to really start looking at the federal borrowing landscape. And again, if this is new information to you, this is going to be maybe some of the first time you're hearing this. If you came here specifically to learn about this, I am going to give you some tools and resources you can leverage after this webinar today. But this is the point in our conversation where we're going to move away from what does grad school cost to how students have historically paid for it and then what's changing. So let's take a moment to talk about the past and how students have typically funded school through federal loans, because this is the part that is changing. So historically, you could think about federal borrowing in two pieces for graduate programs. First was the unsubsidized loan. which is up to, or which now is up to 20,500 a year for eligible grad students. And then if that wasn't enough to cover your cost, Grad PLUS could fill in the rest up to your school's full cost of tuition. That structure mattered because it meant federal borrowing could stretch the cost of the program. But starting July 1, that flexibility is changing. So for new borrowers, Grad PLUS is going away, and federal borrowing is generally capped for most programs. So the big shift here is this. Before, federal funding could often rise to meet your school's cost. Now, for many students, federal borrowing has a ceiling. And if your cost goes beyond that, you'll need a different plan to make up what we call your funding gap, or really the rest of the money that you owe. So if your program costs less or near the federal amount, this may feel manageable. You may feel very little impact. But if your tuition and living costs are going to be well above those limits, your planning questions change. It's no longer how much can I get federally. It becomes what part of my cost will federal loans cover, and what part will I need to solve for another way. So it's a mindset shift. This policy change is not just a policy change, it's a planning change, meaning you may need to reconsider your graduate funding options. And I will share options with you. I'm not here to scare you. There are options available, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in the coming slides. One very important note I want to make on this slide and for this conversation as a whole, this slide, and I will reference it again in other slides, I'm using the number 20,500 broadly to address the changes, but that is not how every graduate student will be affected. Certain professional programs may have higher federal limits, so it's important to confirm what applies specifically to your program. Some of the programs like medical school, law school, have those higher federal limits. But again, it's really important to figure out what applies specifically to you and your program and not make assumptions about that. But again, I'm using the number 20,500 very broadly here, just as a point of reference. So to help make this really clear, we're going to look at a side by side of what's changing and what's not. So Grad PLUS is going away for new borrowers. Most of this is what I covered on the last slide. I really just want to make sure that we've kind of got a clear visual here for you to see it all broken down. It means federal borrowing is capped, and there will be total limits. Again, we want to note that some of the professional programs do have higher limits, but not all. And there are exceptions. So if you've already started in your program and you remain continuously enrolled, you may not be impacted by the changes happening in Grad PLUS. So now, just as important as what's changing as what's not, unsubsidized loans still exist. Your school is still kind of determining your cost, and there may be tuition increases year to year. And other funding options still exist. Other funding options existed prior to the changes, and they will exist beyond. So the system itself isn't totally changing. There are just some shifts that you might need to consider in your planning. So what are these changes, and what does all of this actually mean for you? At this point, we've talked about what's changing structurally, but the next question is, how much does this actually affect you personally? And the reality is that the change may not be evenly felt. Some students may feel very little impact, while others may feel it a little bit more immediate in their planning. So to kind of give you kind of a breakdown of a few different groups that you might find yourself in, it might indicate that you kind of want to like evaluate your plans a little bit more closely. But high cost programs. So as I stated on a previous slide, if your annual cost is close to or below the federal limit, you may not feel the change. It may not reshape your plan at all. But if your program sits well above that number, that's where it starts to matter more. A simple way to pressure test this is to ask, if I only had access to federal loans at the standard limit, how much of my total cost would be uncovered? If that number feels significant to you, then this change is directly relevant to your situation. Students relying on federal loans are another group that may feel this impact a little bit more. So if you had already planned to pay from savings or out of pocket, or you have tuition reimbursement through an employer, you may not feel this. But if you planned to fund your education leveraging primarily federal loans to cover most or all of it, this shift may show up a little bit more for you. So under the old model, many students didn't have to actively plan um, on how to kind of close that remaining cost. The system itself covered it, and under the new structure, it's important to not make that same assumption that federal loans are going to cover everything. You will need to shift from evaluating, will federal loans cover my program, to will federal loans cover part of my program? And then what am I doing to cover the rest? And then students who are already thinking about some repayment strategies. There might be students here that are thinking beyond school, starting to think about repayment. They might be looking at things like income-driven repayment or public student loan forgiveness. If your plan to fund your education relied heavily on one of those two methods, your borrowing strategy might need to change. Federal loans are eligible for income-driven repayment and public student loan forgiveness, but you might not be able to borrow as much as you had planned federally, which means you'll likely have fewer loans that are eligible for those two repayment types. So you'll really want to understand how much can you borrow federally, what portion of your plan has changed or not, and how does any of that impact your long-term repayment path. Um, so again, I think that it's important to kind of have a mindset shift where you're thinking not, am I affected or not, but to what degree of impact is this happening, and what do I need to make sure I'm planning for as a result? So you can ask yourself these three quick questions. Is my program cost meaningfully above the federal amount? Was I planning to rely mostly on federal loans? Am I already thinking about repayment strategies like public student loan forgiveness? And if you answer yes to multiple of those questions, it's going to be important to probably sit down and look at how you're going to cover the difference. So I want to be really, really clear about this. That does not mean that your plan doesn't work. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't go to grad school. It just means that you probably need to sit down and be really intentional about thinking about how you're going to fund your education. And you may think through funding in a little bit more of a structured way than students have in the past. So I am not sitting here telling you that you can't do this or it's going to be hard. It's really about ensuring that you have the information that you need to not make assumptions, to get clarity and get answers to the questions you might have so that you can plan confidently for your future. So that's what we're going to talk through next. If your federal loans may not cover your costs, we'll walk through what students actually do to kind of bridge the rest of the gap. So if federal loans don't cover your full cost, it does not automatically mean you need to take one big private student loan as your next step. It's about building a mix and not just finding one magic answer. So, probably very similarly to what you might have done in your undergraduate program, you want to start by looking for money you don't have to repay. Look for scholarships, grants, or fellowships. In a moment here, I'm going to share some scholarships that we are offering to graduate students that you are welcome to apply for. Uh, there are various websites, various places you can look for additional scholarships. You can talk directly to your school about different scholarships, grants, or fellowships that they may be offering. Um, and then also look at support tied to your program or your job. So if there are things like tuition reimbursement, employer tuition help, even if programs like that don't exist where you work, it might be worth asking or pursuing a business case where you can seek tuition support from an employer. So, really, only after you kind of look for that quote unquote free money and then look for kind of other ways to help bridge the gap, that's when you would maybe shift to thinking about borrowing for what is left. That order matters because not all dollars cost you the same in the long run. So, a scholarship will reduce what you owe. Employer assistance may reduce what you owe and give you kind of experience if you build a capstone or something like that in as a part of your tuition reimbursement plan. Um, and a loan helps you move forward, but it is still something that you need to repay. So if you are considering private loans, the most important thing is to compare them very carefully. You can look at things like the interest rate type, total cost over time, and then really look at evaluating how comfortable you feel with the payment that you'll eventually have. This is going to be a part of a series of webinars we lead on graduate funding. We are going to dig deeper into private student loans in the future. We're also going to dig a little deeper into some very specific tracks. We're going to be doing a webinar in the near future here, very specific for business school, and another for engineering programs. So I'm not going to dive into all the details today about everything. This is 30 minutes. The goal here was to give you a very high level overview. Um, but again, there are some different things to consider with private lending. So again, it's a mindset shift. We're not here to ask like what's the one thing that's going to help cover and bridge the gap, but what is the most manageable combination for me? What fits with my life? What works with my plan? And then once you know your options, the next step is really figuring out numbers that are very specific to you, and what your gap actually looks like. Um, so at this point, everything really comes down to one number, not just your tuition, not even your full cost. What you really need to understand is what's left after everything else is applied. So there's a very simple version of the math. Start with your total cost, subtract any aid or federal loans you plan to leverage, um, and then whatever is left is the number that we call a funding gap. And that's what you actually need to plan for. For most students, this number is maybe really different than what they had expected when they first looked at tuition. It might look a lot better depending on the aid and scholarships you have. It might look a little more daunting. And some of you might be thinking, I don't have all that information and numbers yet. I'm still choosing a school. And that's completely normal. We built a grad school calculator. You can scan the QR code and come back and use this tool over and over. Um, all you need to use is grad calculator. You enter your program, some of your basic info, and it helps to estimate your funding gap for you. I've also mentioned a couple of times here in this conversation some of the federal limits and how they're higher for professional programs. This grad calculator accounts for differences across programs. So those higher federal limits for the professional programs are kind of built into the calculator, so you don't have to guess and do some of that math for yourself. The goal here is to make this really simple. Get out of rough estimates, get into real numbers you can work with, because once you have those numbers, everything else becomes a lot easier to evaluate. So if you take nothing else from today, here's what I would actually do next. First, lock in your real cost, not a rough guess, not what the website says. Look at your program and your specific situation and figure out what your cost to fund your education is. Second, understand what's actually available to you. So understand what your federal borrowing limits are and work with your school to understand any options they might recommend. What do students like you typically do to fund their programs? And then third, lock in on that number that we just talked about on the last slide, your funding gap. What's left to pay after scholarships, after aid, after federal loans. Look at what you need to cover and how you plan to cover it. If you don't have answers to those questions yet, that's completely okay. Again, the calculator can help you to estimate what you need to pay based on your program. We also have scholarships available to you to help to keep pushing on that non-loan side of the equation to bring your funding gap down. And then talk to your school. I really recommend getting really specific with your school. I'm going to open it up for Q&A here in a second. I'm sure you're going to have questions that I can't answer, but speak to your school, speak to your financial aid team to really drill into some of the specifics that are unique to you. So it's really important to ensure you're not just asking what does the program cost, but you're asking questions like, what does this look like for a part-time student or full-time student like me? How do people actually cover their living costs in this program? What's typical for this program in terms of timeline, living, etc. And what do people do when federal loans aren't enough? You don't need to have a perfect plan today, but hopefully you are leaving with some tools to help you get the real numbers and better questions in your toolkit to plan confidently. So I'm going to stop sharing here so that I can better see the chat and any questions that are coming in. All right, open for Q&A. Feel free to just drop questions in the chat if you have them. We've got 2 minutes left for questions. Don't see any questions. Okay. I'll talk a little bit about some of the different professional programs because we do get that question a lot. Um, Off the top of my head, I don't think I can speak to all the professional programs that have different limits. They're typically programs that are doctorate level, licensure type of programs, um, medical school, vet school, law school. I will share that a lot of there are some assumptions being made that are important to check. People moving into healthcare, physical therapy, physical training, nursing might believe that they fall into some of those professional programs, but they might not. So it's important to clarify that with your school and to understand kind of what your limits are. Um, Oh, questions are coming in now. All right. So, question, if a school says no funding, does that mean I can't get federal loans and must use private programs? I don't believe that is the case. I would ask a couple more questions about what no funding means. I'm not sure on that one, but I will take that question back to the team and see if I can maybe provide some answers as we send out webinar recordings. But my assumption would mean that that doesn't mean that you can't leverage federal loans and that you have to use private programs. It might be program specific. So, our master's in architecture programs considered to be professional programs. I will also follow up on that. Off the top of my head, I don't want to misspeak. Professional programs and what are considered professional programs are changing day to day. And so as we share out resources, I will share some links very specifically to resources that you can check regularly that provide some specific information about that. I'm hesitant to share anything really specific on what a professional program is or isn't, again, just because they're changing all the time and I don't want to mislead or misguide. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, everyone. A recording of this webinar will be shared so you can come back and reference any points. And as the webinar is shared, we'll also work on addressing some of the questions that are coming up. I appreciate the questions. We build them into our Q&A documents that we share with schools, with students. So very, very much appreciated. Again, please feel free to leverage the scholarships that we offer on our website. There is a scholarship specific to graduate students. There are also other scholarships available that you can apply for. We are always updating our scholarships page. And so that resource will also be shared post-webinar. And feel free to use our grad calculator. Again, we'll share that resource in case you didn't snip it on the QR code, but we will share that out shortly. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your Monday.